afternoon, I want us to spend some time and look at a scholar who is overlooked quite often. He's not very popular, but his work has been one that not only has been brought to fore in recent light, but one which has, as capitalism develops, become a lot more pertinent to what we 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 can analyze. So Tibor Scitovsky is an economist from the Eastern European. I think he's a Hungarian economist, if I'm not mistaken, and he lectured at Harvard. Very, very importantly, he wrote a text in 1976 called The Joyless Economy. The Joyless Economy. What we'll be doing this afternoon is going through chapters 12 and chapters 13 of The Joyless Economy. And those sections actually have to do with two particular elements of his work. The first is chapter 12 is what's wrong with mass production, and the second, which is chapter 13, is what is wrong or what's wrong with specialization. Now, as you folks are all well aware, division of labor, as conjectured by Smith in 1776 in his Wealth of Nations, is one which is the linchpin of modern economic growth. And in his work, Smith's work, you would have found that he addresses this point as to how a pin factory and how division of labor can actually aid in catalyzing economic growth through improving productivity of firms. Now, if we reread Adam Smith's work, you will find that one of the things which he warned against, or one of the downsides which he warned against from extreme division of labor and specialization, is the notion of monotony. Now, specialization and division of labor have actually become key features in the capitalist economy. If you look at any firm around the world, the mere fact that they are divided into different departments in accordance with a particular title, for example, a marketing department, an accounting department, a finance department. If we look at perhaps medical doctors, the way that they are divided into ENTs and pediatricians and oncologists, cardiac specialists, etc. The fact that they are divided into different specializations of a particular field just goes to show how integral the concept of division of labor and specialization is into the modern economy. And actually, the basis of capitalism and capitalism's growth and high degree of efficiency is from that very simple concept of division of labor and specialization. So does anyone know what that concept was first applied to? I mean, I would have said it earlier, but does anyone have a general idea of it? Let me call on some people here. Some people who have not heard from. Tamika Stewart, can you explain division of labor and specialization for me? You'd obviously have to unmute your mic.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, class. Please mind the noise in my background. My house is very full. Division of labor is just breaking up tasks into smaller parts, and specialization comes about after doing the task repeatedly. So if we're making matchsticks and I'm just cutting wood, after time I'll be an expert in cutting wood as compared to somebody else if the person just now come on because I have been doing that repeatedly.
Right. So thank you for that. And that underscores a concept that a gentleman by the name of Kenneth Arrow later writes in a paper called Learning by Doing, where essentially somebody becomes more apt, or the dexterity of doing a job increases as they go along um, in time. So that concept of learning by doing is a very important one. In addition to that dimension of learning by doing, there is also the fact that there is a tremendous benefit of having someone hone in on a particular task. Why is that so? If you look at a chain, for example, an assembly line, having persons focus on different parts mean that they become experts on that part. That notion, however, by learning of learning by doing underscores elements of it. And if we look at what made Henry Ford's model, for example, so successful, the Fordist model in the early 1900s, Henry Ford's model was so successful because he was able to actually master that division of labor and specialization process. And as a result, when we refer to Fordism and the Fordist type of production structures, you would see that it's what underscores it is the fact that there is mass production. Now, mass production is an absolutely integral part of our society today because, as we know from basic economics, as goods become less scarce or as goods become more abundant, they become cheaper. Now, if we're to talk about improving the quality of life, or if we're to talk about improvements in welfare, what we're speaking about is, from an economist's perspective, the ability to access goods, the ability to use particular goods and services in a manner that it's much cheaper. So Scitovsky writes an introduction to Smith, etc. And he writes at a time, his book is in 1976, and as I would have mentioned in previous classes, it's very important when we're analyzing scholars and analyzing what they write, to also analyze when they write. The emergence of Scitovsky's work in 1976, he writes at a time when the structure of capitalism is actually at its heights. The maturity of a capitalist economy during the period of 1976 it's at an all-time high. Even though there were two oil shocks during that time, we see the emergence of the modern firm. We see the emergence of different modern institutions to support capitalism. And what you have during that time is the third industrial revolution, or the ICT revolution, digital age coming to bear. So what one finds is an increase in the speed and the productivity due to division of labor and specialization, as well as the improvements in technology. But of course, as Smith would have identified, we call Smith in political economy the ultimate optimist, right? With a very optimistic perspective. Perhaps one of the exceptions of that era. What you find is that great monotony emerges, or monotony of work. Now, Smith warns in Wealth of Nations that in spite of the fact that this tool called division of labor and specialization has a tendency to increase the productivity of a worker and the productivity of work by thousandfold, it does have the consequence or the drawback of having laborers become bored and uninterested, or uninterested in the work that they're doing. And he, of course, gives a range of examples in this regard. Now, the entire notion of mass production, as I would have mentioned earlier, is one that really is supposed to give comfort to the average person. Now, in this regard, mass production is seen as a very good thing. So, for example, you could not have had many of the comforts that you enjoy today if they were not mass produced. The reason for that is that they would be too scarce. this goes back to the point which we were having in the discussion before class. It's very important that we understand what economic or industrial revolutions are, because they change in substance the volume of goods that are available in a society. And once you begin to change substantially the volume of goods that are available in society, you'll begin to change the pattern of life. You begin to change the way that people live, or what we say in Latin as the modus vivendi, the way of life or the mode of life of individuals. But the rationale that is given for this is that the welfare improving effects that come as a result of increases in productivity, we also would have a situation where persons, through higher wages or through being able to obtain higher wages, would be able to obtain a better standard of living. So let's take for example communications, ICT, as it's a very relevant one now. In 1920, before the third industrial revolution, the ICT revolution, in 1920, if you had to make a phone call, or worse yet, if you had to take a photograph or a video, the cost of that would be very high. Now, and only a select number of persons would obviously be able to afford that. Now, as a result of mass production of video equipment, audio equipment, cameras, modernization of telecommunications, for example, through cell phones, etc., you now have a situation where a number of persons, or a broad base of persons, have access to these types of technologies. So Scitovsky begins to identify a couple of very important points. And if you look at the title of his work, it's called The Joyless Economy. And why does he call it that? Now, I want to just take a couple of notes. So one of the very first things that he looks at is something called the monotony of production, which essentially translates into the monotony of products. I want you to just take that monotony of production and the monotony of products. And he begins to use a couple of very interesting examples. He talks about handmade dishes, a very simple household item. He says that handmade dishes, if you look at them now, you'll find that they're very boring, very monotonous. I mean, what is the joy in a plate? What is the joy of looking at a dish? But in years gone by, particularly before mass production of plates and before the notion of division of labor and specialization and such sort, the notion of a plate, the commodity of a plate, was one that was valued, and it was one that was interesting from plate to plate. The reason for that is that it was handcrafted, and each one of the plates had a very unique feature to it. Now, for those of you who are interested, you can look at something called the talavera, and that comes from an area in Mexico called Puebla. The talavera is actually a handcrafted plate that now, in contemporary times, sells for quite a lot. What he says, Scitovsky, is that mass-produced items are inherently very boring items, and they lack their visual stimulus, what's called visual stimulus. Now, he raises a couple of very important points. One being, how do we as economists look at the nature of consumption? When we analyze consumption as economists, we analyze based on something called utility, which is the use value of that commodity. Now, as economists, we ignore other very important components of that analysis, very important components of that consumption process. He says that in the notion of consuming, or in the act of consuming, there is a dimension called stimulation or stimulus. And he says that through mass production, that dimension called visual stimulus becomes absent. Because why? All of the products begin to look the same. So, like I would have mentioned earlier, if you think about a dish, a plate that you eat from, what is impressive to look at the plate? What is it that's so impressive about that? But if you take a look in ancient history, you take a look at other modes of production. For example, an ancient mode of production during the Greek or the Roman rule, you'll find that they place particular emphasis on what they used to eat with, etc. And the pieces were very interesting to look at. So that component of visual stimulus is very much present. The other example that Scitovsky gives, and it's a very relevant example, he says, look at what the architecture of city homes have become. If you look at perhaps the United Kingdom, and in particular London, or if you look at maybe say San Francisco, elements of San Francisco, like take for example at the beginning of that series, Full House, where you see all of the houses and they essentially look the same. Now, if you take a drive around, for example, a local community here in Guyana, one of the newly developed housing projects or so, you'll find that they're very interesting houses to look at. The reason for that is that these houses are not mass produced. Um, of course, those are in the areas that they don't mass produce the houses, or where they most turnkey homes. Those are not those areas where all of them essentially look the same. And when you go into these areas, do you have any sort of visual stimulus? The houses are very boring to look at. Now, take for example, let's take another example. Take for example, when you go to some of those homes, or some of those areas in the United States. I usually tell people, once you visit one or two of the developed Western countries, you have visited all, because the architecture is very much similar. Now, the architecture in the capitalist or in the modern capitalist economy is as a result of the modern capitalist production mode of production, which is one that focuses more on efficiency and division of labor, output, and productivity, as opposed to any other dimension of consumption. If you take one of the modern cities in one of the Western countries and you juxtapose one of those against an ancient city or one from the medieval times or the Gothic times, you'd see that there are extraordinary gaps in the way that the architecture is. For example, if one looks at Spain, particularly Madrid in Spain, if one looks at Italy, particularly Milan in Italy, if one looks even at the islands that were very early on in the imperialist expansion of those countries, for example, Cuba, you'll find that their architecture is absolutely beautiful and it's very stimulating to look at. If you take a drive maybe in Manhattan, what is the visual stimulus you have from looking at a rectangular glass building going up into the air? You don't find tourism really in that regard. And what he does is that Scitovsky provides some empirical data to support this claim. He says if you look over the years, and of course he writes this text in 1976, he says the number of visits to America actually is much less than the visits to somewhere like Mexico. Where he says in the 1970s, one of the years in the 1970s, only about 3.3 million people visited the United States, in comparison to a country like Mexico, where 7.5 or 7.6 million persons visited. If you look at where tourists go, tourists usually flock to areas where they can be visually stimulated. So he offers this as an explanation of what in social sciences we call an unintended consequence of a particular system. Now, this is important to note because As the world becomes more developed in the capitalist mode of production, you'll find that this feature becomes much more pervasive. And he says, look at even the fashion in the car industry. Um, the car industry, for example, where previously, or in the 1950s and in the 1960s, and I would have mentioned at the beginning that if you look at the development of capitalism, you'll find that the car culture is one that generally follows that trend. In the 1950s and the 1960s, there were a number of different designs and modifications that those living in the capitalist world could have done um, to their their cars. For example, they could have all of those muscle cars with that were produced by Pontiac, by Ford, by all of these different companies, Dodge, Chevrolet, etc. You would have found that you could have done any number of modifications to them. Um, Whereas in contemporary times, it's much different because the mass production notion has been taken to even a further level. The division of labor and specialization process has become so specialized, so monotonous, and so highly um, arranged or produced, highly produced around a particular set of skills, around a particular set of tasks that one can actually automate the car industry now. So this is where I just want to bring it forward outside of what we're discussing and encourage all of you. I'll send the text and I send the book for you to have a read of Klaus Schwab's Fourth Industrial Revolution. That's an important text because he begins to identify a framework to see which of these types of jobs will be susceptible to losses as a result of the development of artificial intelligence. So whereas in the 1920s, you would have found persons working along an assembly line, individuals, so that they're able to put a human touch or a human element to designing that car and to you know, fitting that car together, etc. Now it's much different. Now you have machines that essentially, you know, they operate like arms and they fit everything together. So what that does, it makes the process a lot more precise. It makes the process a lot more exact. It is, of course, a mechanical process, but it removes that humane or that human element of the concept. Now, what you find as a result, therefore, is that you have a cultural transformation of the consumerism or the consumer element in the society. Whereas persons no longer seek visual stimulus, or persons no longer are too concerned with how beautiful something looks, but rather it's a trade-off for simplicity and functionalism. It's a trade-off for simplicity and functionalism. So if you think about it, most of the things which are very visually stimulating, beautiful to look at, those things are not really cheap things. And if you look at those things that are cheap and common everyday household items, those are the items which are mass produced. They're not very interesting to look at, but they are very functional and very useful in their simplicity. Let's take, for example, what is the joy of buying a washing machine and sitting and looking at it? There isn't much joy in that. What is the joy of buying a microwave and looking at it? There's not much joy in that. But these are very functional items. And had they not been for the mass production, division of labor, specialization, capitalist mode of organization, output, and productivity improving types of organizations, you would not have been able to enjoy that comfort which comes from it. So what the division of labor and specialization process in capitalism or under the capitalist mode of production does is that it renders comfort to a large mass of persons. And when you look at the text that he does, you can theorize a trade-off between comfort and visual stimulus. Like you can envision what that downward sloping inverse curve would be, where comfort can be perhaps placed on the y-axis, stimulus placed on the x-axis, and you have that inverse relation. So as regards the monotony of production, these are some of the comments which Scitovsky mentions in chapter 12. He then goes on to discuss another dimension, which is referred to as the banalization of art. Banalization, Banalization. Banalization essentially means a trivialization. So the trivialization of art. And what we're talking about here is the trivialization of art and arts in general, the notion of literature, the notion of literary works, paintings, other visual types of stimulus. Now, excuse me. What Scitovsky says is that in a modern world, there seems to be a scarcity of imagination. And he blames this scarcity of imagination, or the absence of imagination in the modern world, on the mode of production, or as a consequence of the mode of production called capitalism. And he essentially says that technological growth, whilst it causes an increase in productivity or the productivity of labor, it is very lopsided. And when we say lopsided, it means that it's lopsided towards capital. Because what it does for laborers is that increases in technology make work much easier for laborers. After all, a technology is something which makes work easier. And since that technology makes work much easier, you actually reduce the creative element of an individual. So if you think about how many persons, when they go to work, make statements like they're bored at work, or their job is boring, and they view it as being a very daunting and dreary exercise. Reason for that is because the technology and the presence of technology has actually caused the creativity perhaps associated with their job, or which would have been previously associated with their job, to just simply become a very bland process. Now, the notion of art is no longer valued, according to Scitovsky, as it used to, because technology now, it's usually applied to comfort, or it's used to produce a degree of comfort, and not really channeled towards stimulus. Now, for example, if you look, he talks about even the music composition that we have in contemporary times as being very monotonous. Now, he says the reason for that is that those who are utilizing technology in the music industry are limited by what the technology can actually offer. So, for example, for those of you who might follow, let's maybe say dancehall music or reggae music, you know that there's something called a rhythm, and that rhythm would be a particular beat. Now, in that beat, you'd have a number of different artists who voice over that beat, but that beat is the same thing. And he says, he doesn't make reference to that, I'm making reference to that. But if you take something like that and you compare it to the uniqueness of Beethoven, or the uniqueness of jazz music, the uniqueness of that sound prior to the mass production, quote unquote, of music, you'll find that it's something which is much more unique to the individual artist. And as such, it becomes very different. Now, the world itself, as a result of the capitalist mode of production, is focused very much on productivity, efficiency, functionalism, items which can be demanded. And of course, the objective function is one which is profit maximizing. Now, the role of art, therefore, the role of art in the capitalist mode of production is completely dissipated, and technology is not applied um, in a proportional manner the way that it is to those sectors or to those areas that the capitalist mode of production deems as being um, contributory to economic growth in particular. So if we take a look at those items that are produced by technology in accordance with what the invisible hand would would dictate, you'd find that those items that are produced are essentially cheap in nature. But then let's take, for example, those who go auctioneering or auctioning rather at auctions for paintings. Those paintings are pretty expensive and they become auctioned for millions and millions of US dollars. Now, they're very unique to those particular artists, and they are absolutely they're absolutely not easily replicated. Why? Because it doesn't come from a mass-produced specialization, division of labor type of outcome. So I just wanna say that I think Scitovsky makes a very important point in this regard, in terms of offering us a dimension to think about um, where have we, as a human race, made certain in our pursuit for commodities, making life easier, etc. Have we given way or given up on those elements that we would have perhaps enjoyed in a previous era? Now, those are questions. What therefore is the effect of this mass welfare improvement which we have? So for me, that would be the main question coming out of chapter 12. That what's wrong with mass production? Do we have any questions in
Uh,
this regard? Do we have anything which anyone would like to say?
yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Good evening, class. Sir, so would this be the reason why they teach us in development economics that the usual growth path of countries that are becoming industrialized is that you would usually have a decrease in the contribution to the agricultural sector, GDP wise? You would have an increase in the manufacturing sector, but then eventually you would begin to see a rise in the appreciation for arts and different crafts, which would um, point somewhere to the services sector.
In You're talking here, of course, about 1960. Walt Whitman Rostow's stages of growth theory, right?
Yeah, Sydney had taught us the.
Right. So in the stages of growth, what is it that you are particularly saying? What are you drawing the allusion to here? This
Uh,
section about appreciation of arts.
yes, sir. Trying to link it back to what you're teaching us here in labor.
Mhm. Right.
Uh,
Now, which stage does Rostow say that there is an appreciation of arts?
I believe he says it's the stage after industrialization, which is the final one.
Hmm. Right.
So,
Now, if you take what Rostow has said there. Now, Rostow's work, of course, is what you call he titles the work a non-communist manifesto on the stages of growth of economic growth. Um, because what Rostow was trying to do was counteract what Marx had said in adumbrating the different dimensions of the long trajectory of history. So when Rostow talks about um, the increased appreciation for art, in an industrialized world. He is talking, if we're to link that back with what Scitovsky is saying, he is talking about how individuals existing in that highly mature capitalist economy, how those individuals would begin to value things which are not produced by that capitalist machinery. Why? Because those elements which are not being produced by the capitalist machinery, by that high degree of division of labor and specialization, those elements actually have the different components of consumption included in it. For example, visual stimulus, for example, the literary forms that provide stimulus for the different dimensions of the consumption. So yes, absolutely, and that's why you will find Rostow mentioning that. I am not sure if if Scitovsky would have taken that bit into consideration. It's been a while since I've touched on his work, but Rostow writes before Scitovsky does. But yes, when you see that appreciation coming for arts, it's because it's something unique. It's something which is not mass produced. It is not something which is widely available, and as such, there must be an appreciation for it. Perhaps that's something that Rostow would have identified, because what he did, he actually did a mass survey of countries. And effectively, he would have looked at what the common factors are. And that perhaps arose as a common factor in his work of surveying the countries and analyzing. So I hope that I've addressed your question sufficiently.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? Any other questions? Right. So chapter 13 for Tibor Scitovsky focuses on what's wrong with specialization. Now, this for me is a very interesting chapter, and it is very pertinent to labor economics, because it begins to actually identify factors that cause wage differentials. Scitovsky says that if you look at the capitalist mode of production, you will find that there is a high degree of specialization. He says that the mode of production actually encourages persons to become more specialized. How do we see that being reflected? If you look at, for example, doctors, how many of you, well, I can't even say that because we're not in a classroom, but many of you have friends perhaps who are in the medical field, and you will hear them say, when they're finished their MBBS or at the University of Guyana or their basic medical degree, you'll hear them say, I wouldn't make money until I'm specialized. You'll hear them saying things like that. And the same goes for other professions. So for example, a lawyer will make more money when he becomes a specialized lawyer. That is an attorney who is specialized in a particular area. An economist, for example, will make more money if he is specialized in a particular area and he focuses his career on that, such that he becomes a subject matter expert. What this does, however, is that it gives way to something which would have been previously called the generalist. So the advancement of this notion called a specialist comes against the decline of what is termed as the generalist. Now, if you look at the capitalist mode of production, what they're saying when persons say that they are rewarded more or they are paid more when they are specialized, is that the capitalist mode of production is actually rewarding persons through higher wages who are highly specialized. And that is an important point, because if you think about what that will do over an array of persons or over a broad base of society, and then you take it in a dynamic form, you'll find that there is actually a depression in the number of persons who are generalists. And there's a marked decline in the world of generalists. Now, if you take, Deborah, I see you have your hand up. Would you like to ask something?
Sir, for the past 5 minutes, I've been hearing you like a little here, a little there, so I didn't hear that last point properly.
Okay,
I don't know
sure.
if it's my internet or your internet. I'm not sure if everybody else heard you.
There ain't been anybody else with the problem?
No, sir.
And Deborah, it might be your internet. Maybe your neighbor using it. Yeah. Fear not though, I am recording the session, so you'll always be able to play it back.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You miss large parts of it.
Sir, the recording would be available in the group, right?
Yeah. So what I'll do the recording, and then I'll perhaps, depending on how badly interrupted it is or such like, I'll perhaps edit it and then send it. But I'll make the recordings publicly available.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah. Now, what we have seen over time, therefore, is that there's been a tremendous decline in generalists in society, or as opposed to what we have found in terms of the increase in specialists, or when put against the increase in specialists. The market, therefore, and the capitalist mode of production is telling us, through its rewarding of higher wages of specialists, that specialists under this mode of production are more valued. Let's take, for example, the decline in what is called a general practitioner. In years gone by, you would have found that many families actually have a family doctor who is a general practitioner. And that person would have been very au fait with the family. The person would have known the family history, the family conditions, what would have been passed from generation to generation. And as such, he would have been able to treat a person in a much more personalized approach, as opposed to a specialist who, if you look at maybe say House MD, for example, the show, you'll find that what causes them oftentimes to misdiagnose persons is that they are not familiar with different elements of their history, or they're not familiar with different elements of their life. And this is a major difference between a specialist and a generalist. Now, over time, there has been less value placed on the skills associated with generalists. And as such, you find that there are low wages or low prestige attributed to those in society who are generalists. How many times don't you see doctors, medical doctors who are extreme specialists, or attorneys who are extreme specialists, adorning the newspapers and adorning different media, where their accomplishments in their field, for example, are highlighted. This is the type of prestige that is associated with an individual who is highly specialized. But if you take the obverse of that and you look at a generalist, how many times do you see those persons being adorned? Now, who are the generalists as opposed to the specialists? Let's take a very practical survey of professions around us. A generalist, to be a primary school teacher, for example, one would have to be a generalist. To be a nurse, one would have to be a generalist. And for me, the very, very important point that Scitovsky highlights is that mothers in society are generalists. Now, I believe that in explaining this, and in explaining this entire construct, Scitovsky has actually hit the nail on the head with why we don't attribute as much prestige and therefore recognition of the role of mothers in economic growth and social stability. Mothers are not rewarded by the market system, their contributions to maintaining a family unit, that is, and the value which they add to society is not given um, the type of recognition that it should. Take, for example, when you are calculating your gross domestic product, one of the major components that is removed is the contribution of women in households. Now, they do contribute to a country's output. They do contribute in molding an individual. All of those are tasks. Had they not been present in the society, there would not have been a personalized approach to molding a particular individual for a society. Now, if you think about this, this is an element that is not specialized, but it serves a tremendously important function in maintaining social order. And of course, social order, as we would see in later work, for example, Douglas North's work on social order, is an extremely important, necessary condition in catalyzing and maintaining economic growth. And we've seen this notion being repeated. I think that it's very pronounced with in particular mothers. But you also have older persons who may perhaps have quite a bit of knowledge that is very expansive. They are not given that type of acknowledgement. So they know quite a bit about managing, balancing family budgets. They know a number of things, a jack of all trades. But we have, of course, termed that, flipped that term to say jack of all trades, master of none, reflective, I believe, of our society. And what becomes very pronounced, therefore, is the fact that if you have a society that places prestige on specialization and you reward those persons very highly, you adorn them in the newspapers, etc., those persons who are very specialized and such like, those are the persons who obtain a tremendous amount of respect in society. And those are the persons who, through what is called the demonstration effect, persons in society try to emulate. All right? And as a result of that attempt to emulate those persons and placing them on a pedestal, you end up with a society, according to the works of Scitovsky and moving in through his analysis, you end up with a society where the societal issue of the lack of respect and acknowledgement of the value of the contribution of women and elders to a lesser extent, but particularly the value of the contribution of women are not acknowledged. And that is very, very clear if we look at the modern capitalist world. So therefore, we can say that these generalist jobs, these generalist modes of, or the generalist types of jobs, they are, through the capitalist mode of production, ascribed low degrees of prestige, but they are tremendously important for maintaining social order, and they do provide a high degree of welfare improving services to an economy, which over time economists have not even been able to capture in their measurement of a country's economic growth, and even more so, a country's economic development. Now, what are some ways that generalists actually contribute to welfare? And I just want you to take take 3 points in this regard. The first is that of family well-being. Generalists contribute to family well-being very, very highly. The other is that it's a tremendous source of self-satisfaction. Persons who are generalists are oftentimes extremely self-satisfied once things begin to go their way. They're also very contented persons because many of them don't seek out that social prestige which is ascribed upon them through the capitalist mode of productions, rewarding, etc. When they would have chosen the career, or when they would have chosen motherhood, for example, this would have not been something that's on their mind. The other way is that they exert an enormous amount of influence on the economy in a very passive way, in a very passive form. So, for example, what job or what profession you choose, or what area of study you choose, or rather, let me take it in the reverse, what area of study you don't choose, or what profession you don't choose, could be ascribed to the influence of your family, and in particular, the influence of a mother on a child. They would provide them with the social licensing almost, or that accepting form in that regard. So the decisions which are made of persons to be guided into different elements in the labor market are actually as an indirect result of the advice and the influence of the generalists. Now, the world has become so highly specialized that in contemporary times, you even have ENTs. Those are ear, nose, throat specialists, who are some are specialized on the left side, some are specialized on the right side of the ear. And that just goes to show the degree of specialization that exists. I think as capitalism begins to move along, and as the mode of production becomes more complex and more mature in its form, you'll find that persons will become even more specialized. Those jobs which are highly mechanical and are extraordinarily specialized, those are the jobs which actually do face the greatest threat of being replaced by artificial intelligence, which within the context of the fourth industrial revolution is a consideration. So I wanted to offer those. Let me just see in my notes here if I have any other comments which I wanted to make. Right. Just 2 other very quick things. The fact that you have an increase in specialization, what that actually does is that it changes the creativity component from a consumer being able to drive it more towards a producer driving it. Let me just take a moment to explain what I mean by that. If you look at the artisanal mode of production, for example, which is an individual who has a particular skill and he is an artisan operating at a small cottage level. In Guyana, for example, many jewelers are artisanal producers. In an artisanal mode of production, the consumer goes to the artisan and explains to the artisan the type of product which they want. Whereas, if you look at a highly specialized gold industry or jewelry industry, it is the producer who produces, and then, based on his or her his or her perception of what the consumer may demand. And then that individual, the individual puts forward the product into the market, and the consumer then chooses among a range. Whereas in an artisanal mode of production, or in an alternative form of capitalism, the consumer is the one that actually drives it. If you take, for example, the production of cars, you can actually request a custom-made car, and it was much more common in the earlier forms than it is now because of the change in the production mode. So therefore, what it does is that it takes a very important element of the consumer behavior and the consumer's ability to choose out of the hands of the consumer. And I think that the artisanal production mode, which is still seen in Guyana by the jewelry industry, is one which is very relevant. And the other thing which I want to mention here is that there is a tremendous amount of joy that is taken in a process which is not mechanized, and a process where an individual is actually participatory in the process. Take, for example, how many persons derive a great amount of joy, particularly females, derive a tremendous amount of joy from interior decorating and designing their homes, etc. There is a profession which has emerged in recent years called interior decorating, where a person is actually specialized in decorating a particular interior, or homes interior, business interior, etc. And if you look at, for example, vacationing, Scitovsky talks about the fact that over the years, you've actually seen firms emerging which do everything for you. Book the hotels. Now we know about things like Expedia, which do everything from the beginning to the end. He says that you found in the society that there was a lot more satisfaction and cohesion amongst family and family units when they could have started and planned their vacations, etc. together. So Scitovsky is an author that approaches the workings and the machinations of the capitalist mode of production from a very peripheral perspective. He takes the core principles and he looks at the unintended consequences of each one. I believe that his contributions are extraordinarily important because they bring a very softer side of economics and of economic development to the fore. And it also gives us a very important consideration for why there is a wage differential existing between males and females. Now, the ultimate question that is posited to us, I believe, by Scitovsky is how can we design the capitalist mode of production? Note that he is not anti-capitalist. He is simply highlighting the area of work which was not furthered upon by Smith, an author subsequent. How do we design the capitalist mode of production to be one that does not only recognize or give credence and give reward and prestige to those who are highly specialized, but how do we reward those persons who also serve an extraordinarily important social function through their operation of being a generalist? How do we ensure that sufficient prestige or sufficient recognition of those individuals and their contribution to social stability and to economic growth? How do we recognize that? How do we account for it? How do we ensure that the notion of a generalist continues to be present in the society, since it is a necessary condition for economic growth? And that, I believe, from my perspective, is Scitovsky's most important contribution. And even until now, and as the capitalist mode of production furthers in its in development, that becomes even more important and a very integral question for us to answer. So with that, I said, let me start today with just something that is a little bit lighter. Scitovsky, of course, is not a well-known scholar, but I believe that he offers important insights for economists, and particularly for economists who are interested in a field called new home economics. These considerations are very important for us as development thinkers, for us who are learning about the labor market, and for us who want to ensure that the capitalist mode of production remains stable and continues to expand. So with that, I'll end this afternoon session, of course, and I'll open to any questions if there are. So any questions? All right. Well, if no questions, I think what